The dust rose in choking clouds as the wagon train lurched to a halt, each vehicle settling with the groaning protest of exhausted wood and metal. Pressed a handkerchief against her nose and mouth, her gray eyes watering as she gazed out at the landscape that would become her home. Nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared her for this desolation. The Texas frontier stretched endlessly in every direction. Scorched earth the color of old bone, scattered mesquite trees twisted into tortured shapes by relentless wind, and a sky so vast and merciless it seemed to dwarf the very concept of human ambition. The settlement consisted of perhaps a dozen structures, most of them barely worthy of the name. A general store with a sagging porch, a schoolhouse with gaps between its planks, a church whose whitewash had faded to a sickly gray. Behind these stood scattered homesteads, their adobe and timber construction appearing almost organic, as if they'd grown reluctantly from the unforgiving earth rather than been built upon it. His companion, Wells, let out a small whimper from the adjacent seat. Had spent the entire journey from Missouri clutching a leather journal filled with sketches of the life she'd imagined. Gardens with proper English roses, a parlor with furniture imported from Philadelphia, evening gatherings where conversation turned on literature and philosophy. Reality had delivered instead a wasteland that seemed to mock every civilized aspiration. "Good Lord," whispered James, husband, as he helped both women down from the wagon. "They told us it would be rough, but I confess I didn't truly understand." The heat hit them like a physical force, not the humid warmth of the east, but a dry, searing blast that seemed to extract moisture from their very bones. His traveling dress, practical navy wool lined with linen, suddenly felt like an instrument of torture. Beside her, young Sarah stepped down with considerably more grace, her slender frame somehow managing to look composed despite the chaos of arriving cattle, shouting men, and scattered luggage. Sarah had always possessed an unusual quality, a stillness that suggested she was observing rather than merely existing. At 23, she was the youngest of the unmarried women, having lost her parents to typhoid 2 years prior and chosen the frontier as an escape from the suffocating sympathy of Eastern relatives. Had noticed during the journey that Sarah asked questions, genuine, unguarded inquiries about how things actually worked on the frontier, what women were expected to do, how one managed without the conveniences of civilization. The other ladies had dismissed her curiosity as unseemly, but recognized it as something more valuable, honest hunger for understanding. "Welcome, welcome," a stout man with a weathered face and surprisingly gentle eyes pushed through the crowd. This was Sheriff Thomas, the settlement's facto leader. His smile was genuine, though it didn't quite reach his eyes that held the permanent wariness of someone who'd seen too much. Mrs. Wells, Miss, and the Hendersons, thank the Lord, we've been mighty eager for some. Well, for some civilization, truth be told." Found this comment oddly amusing. They were supposed to bring civilization to this place, they who felt like children cast adrift in an unknown sea. Yet she straightened her shoulders, summoning the composure that decades of Boston society demanded. "Sheriff, we're grateful for your welcoming committee. The journey was arduous, but we're ready to begin our work here." Before the sheriff could respond, a commotion erupted near the livery stable. A magnificent black horse reared up, its powerful frame silhouetted against the afternoon glare. The man controlling it sat easy in the saddle despite the animal's protest, a tall figure whose movements carried an unconscious grace that spoke of a lifetime spent on horseback. His hat was pulled low, shadowing his face, but caught an impression of weathered features and a jaw set with quiet authority. "Easy, Shadow," the man murmured, his voice carrying across the square with the kind of calm authority that suggested the horse understood not just his words but his intent. The animal settled, ears pricked forward, responding to something deeper than command. Gasped softly, "Is that?" "That's Clay," Sheriff said, a note of something, respect, wariness coloring his voice. "One of the finest cattlemen in Texas, runs the largest spread within 50 miles. He and his men will be, well, they'll be a considerable presence around here." found herself starring despite her better judgment. There was something almost primitive about the way this man occupied the space around him. His shirt, unbuttoned at the collar, revealed sun-darkened skin. His hands, even from this distance, bore evidence of hard labor, calloused, strong, capable. And his eyes, when he finally lifted his gaze from his horse, were a startling pale gray-blue, the color of winter sky. They passed across the gathered settlers with an expression of frank assessment, lingering for a moment before moving on. That brief contact sent a peculiar tremor through her, not precisely attraction, though it contained that element, but something more unsettling, recognition of a foreign world, a way of being that existed entirely outside the parameters of her experience. This man had never studied the proper way to enter a drawing room. He'd never worried about the composition of a guest list or the appropriate response to society gossip. He existed in a dimension where such concerns dissolved like morning mist. "Ladies," Sheriff continued, seemingly oblivious to the charged moment that had just passed, "I should mention that the ranch hands from the major spreads come to town on Saturday nights. It's the main social outlet around these parts. We're organizing a proper dance for this Saturday, actually. Thought it might be good for everyone to get acquainted." A dance. His mind grasped at this familiar concept like a drowning person reaching for rope. A structured social event with established rules and procedures. Surely a dance would provide some anchor of normalcy, some framework where her skills, years of deportment training, conversation management, social navigation, would prove valuable rather than absurdly irrelevant. Yet even as she formed this thought, she watched Clay swing down from his horse with a lithe movement that suggested a man utterly unaccustomed to the constraint of formal ballrooms. He moved like water, like wind, like someone for whom the rigid structures of civilized society would be a cage. A dance, breathed. Perhaps it won't be entirely hopeless after all. But wasn't thinking of ballrooms or waltzes. She was thinking of winter sky eyes and the barely suppressed smile of a man who'd just taken a full measure of the Eastern women who'd arrived to domesticate his frontier. She was thinking of the vast distance between her world and his, and the peculiar electricity that had crackled across that distance for one suspended moment. Around her, and the other ladies discussed dance cards and appropriate musicians, their voices already spinning fantasies of civilization imposed upon this savage landscape, but stood quietly, dust still settling on her traveling dress, and watched Clay speak to his men with the easy authority of someone who expected obedience not because of his position, but because of who he was. The central conflict had just become visible, though none of them fully understood it yet. They had come to change this frontier, to civilize it. They hadn't reckoned with what the frontier, embodied in men like Clay, might do to them in return. The dance hall, a hastily converted barn with fresh whitewash and borrowed oil lamps, smelled of hay, perfume, and possibility, stood along the perimeter, watching adjust the flower arrangements for the third time, each repositioning more anxious than the last. The settler women had spent 3 days preparing, transforming the space with the fervor of those defending civilization itself against encroaching barbarism. Fresh muslin draped the rough wooden beams. Someone had managed to procure sheet music. A string quartet from the settlement's educated families had been assembled, their instruments somewhat out of tune, but their intent unmistakably refined. By 8 o'clock, the paradox became unavoidable. The Cowboys arrived like a weather system, sudden, forceful, and entirely indifferent to the careful arrangements made for their reception. They came in boots that tracked dust across the freshly swept floor, in shirts that hadn't seen a pressing iron, with the peculiar swagger of men accustomed to dominating physical space. They smelled of leather, horses, tobacco, and something else, something wild and untamed that made carefully maintained composure waver. Clay entered last, and understood immediately why. His arrival created a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, a recognition of hierarchy that required no explanation. He wore a clean shirt with actual buttons, and he'd combed his hair, but these gestures toward civilization seemed almost performative, a man donning a costume he'd never quite fit into. His pale eyes scanned the room with the same assessment he'd given the settlers upon their arrival, cataloging, measuring, judging. He stood apart from his men, and they naturally gravitated toward the punch bowl and the edges of the space, forming an exclusive territory that made it abundantly clear they hadn't come to dance so much as to observe. Announced, her voice pitched high with forced brightness, "Please, do join us for the opening waltz. We're quite eager to establish some proper social traditions in our settlement." The silence that followed was deafening. Several of the cowboys exchanged glances, not hostile but distinctly amused. One particularly broad-shouldered man with a face actually smiled, though whether in kindness or mockery couldn't determine. "Ma'am," Clay said, stepping forward with the courtesy of someone who'd learned social graces but carried them lightly, like borrowed clothes he could shed at any moment. "I reckon we appreciate the invitation, but most of us aren't much practiced at waltzing. We'd probably step on your toes something fierce." "Nonsense," heard herself say. The words emerged before her rational mind could suppress them, driven by something deeper, a stubborn refusal to accept defeat before the night had truly begun. "The waltz is quite simple. 3/4 time, a basic box step. Surely men who can master horsemanship can master a dance." She'd meant it as gentle encouragement, but it emerged as challenge. Clay turned toward her fully, and those pale eyes held something that made her breath catch, not quite mockery, not quite respect, but something intensely present and aware. "Is that so?" he said quietly. He set down his punch cup and extended his hand. "Then I suppose I should prove you right, Mrs." The string quartet, sensing opportunity, launched into a Strauss waltz, placed her hand in his, and immediately understood her miscalculation. His palm was calloused, his grip confident, and when he pulled her into the dance position, she found herself pressed closer than propriety usually permitted. She could feel the strength in his frame, the controlled power of a man accustomed to commanding livestock 3 times her weight. He was terrible. His steps were stiff, his rhythm uncertain, and he clearly harbored profound discomfort with the prescribed closeness of the dance. Yet he persisted with grim determination and found herself controlling her breathing, maintaining her composure, trying desperately not to notice how his jaw clenched when he made a misstep. "You're doing fine," she offered, attempting to guide him more gently. "I'm stepping all over your feet and holding you like you might break," he replied, the corner of his mouth twitching. "That doesn't feel particularly fine to me." Around them, the other cowboys had watched this exchange with interest. Emboldened, several pairs began attempting the waltz, clumsy, uncertain, but genuinely trying. Its expression shifted from anxiety to something approaching triumph. Sarah, dancing with the cowboy whose name turned out to be Robert, seemed unsurprised by the awkwardness. She simply adjusted her steps to accommodate his and offered him a genuine smile that somehow made him look less hard, less weathered. But as the waltz progressed, something shifted. Clay stopped thinking about the steps and simply moved with her. The rigidity left his frame. He relaxed into the rhythm and discovered that beneath the self-consciousness, he danced with natural grace, the same unconscious fluidity she'd observed when he dismounted from his horse. When he stopped watching his feet and simply responded to the music and to her, he became something almost beautiful in his physical presence. The dance ended too soon. As stepped back, breathless and flushed, she caught Sarah watching her with an expression of knowing amusement that made her face burn hotter. "Thank you," Clay said formally. "That wasn't entirely disastrous." "You're a quick study," replied, surprised to hear her voice sounding almost breathless. "I'm a quick learner when the motivation is sufficient." The look he gave her suggested the motivation had been specifically her challenge, her insistence that his world and her world weren't entirely incompatible. As the evening progressed, the collision between cultures became less confrontational and more genuinely complex. A cowboy named Jake attempted to explain cattle ranching to James, who responded with questions about grazing costs and market values that seemed to surprise Jake into actually engaging in substantive conversation. And Robert debated whether the settlement should plant wheat or corn, drawing on agricultural journals she'd brought, while Robert contributed practical knowledge about what the land would actually support. Yet beneath this growing accord, tension simmered. When one of the younger cowboys made a crude joke that made Sarah blush, the entire room seemed to inhale sharply. When expressed concern that the ranch hands worked on Sundays, Clay responded with a calm statement that cattle didn't observe the Sabbath and neither did he. When suggested that perhaps they should consider establishing social restrictions on alcohol consumption, several cowboys simply turned away, making clear what they thought of that particular suggestion. By the evening's end, something had shifted. The women had ceased to be abstract concepts, representatives of a threatening civilization, and become actual humans with intelligence, resilience, and unexpected capacity for humor. The cowboys had ceased to be ignorant brutes and revealed themselves as capable, thoughtful, and far more complex than their appearance suggested. Yet the fundamental conflict remained unresolved, lurking beneath new civility like bedrock beneath soil. Two ways of living, two understandings of what mattered, had collided and found unexpected common ground. But compromise and coexistence, was beginning to understand, were entirely different things. As Clay helped her with her shawl at evening's end, his hand brushed her shoulder, and she felt that peculiar recognition again. The knowledge that something between them was beginning, something neither of them had invited but both of them, perhaps, had been waiting for without knowing it. "You dance better than you pretend not to," he said quietly. "Why do that?" She met his gaze and found herself telling the truth. "Because where I come from, a man who dances too well is considered somewhat suspicious. We prefer our less accomplished." He smiled then, a real smile that transformed his entire face. "Then it's fortunate neither of us is in Boston anymore, Mrs." 6 months later, the settlement bore the unmistakable marks of transformation, though not in the way had initially imagined. The schoolhouse, which had stood nearly empty, now held 23 children ranging from 5 to 16. Sarah, having discovered an unexpected gift for teaching, spent her days instructing the ranchers' children alongside settler offspring, blending rigid curriculum with practical knowledge that made education relevant to their frontier existence. She taught arithmetic through cattle accounting and literature, through letters home to distant relatives. The church, too, had evolved. Rather than insisting on Sunday services that conflicted with ranch work, had negotiated with sheriff for a modified schedule, a dawn service for those who could attend, followed by a community meal that became the settlement's primary social gathering. Even Clay, who'd made his skepticism about organized religion abundantly clear, now appeared occasionally, sitting in the back pew with an expression of tolerant bemusement as delivered readings from and rather than exclusively biblical passages. The transformation in herself was perhaps most striking. Her hands, once soft and carefully maintained, now bore calluses from working in the community garden she'd established. She'd abandoned her corsets entirely, discovering that the frontier cared nothing for the silhouette of propriety and everything for functional capability. Her day dress, a practical cotton blend, allowed movement impossible in her Eastern wardrobe. Yet she'd lost none of her intelligence or dignity. She'd simply redirected it toward problems that actually required solving. Wells had become the settlement's facto medical advisor, her journals and reference books supplemented by hard-won practical experience in treating everything from snake bites to infected wounds. Her husband James now managed the general store in partnership with two of the younger cowboys, having discovered an unexpected talent for negotiating between rancher and settler interests. The tensions that had marked their early days had resolved into a cautious, genuine partnership that benefited everyone. It was Sarah's engagement to Robert that crystallized the settlement's transformation. The cowboy, who'd revealed his scars came from a cattle stampede when he was barely 20, had proposed with the practical directness of a frontier man, offering Sarah a small homestead on the ranch, and the understanding that their life together would demand equal parts romance and responsibility. When Sarah accepted, the celebration brought ranchers and settlers together not as two groups learning to coexist, but as a genuine community. Yet the most significant transformation centered on and Clay. It began subtly, Clay appearing at the schoolhouse with news of a neighboring rancher's herd, staying to observe Sarah's teaching methods and offering suggestions about cattle management that somehow illuminated the concept of supply and demand for the students. Attending a cattle auction, her presence initially shocking to the ranch hands but soon accepted as she proved capable of understanding the economics underlying their work. Long conversations that began about settlement needs and ranch concerns evolved into discussions of philosophy, ambition, and what constituted a meaningful life. On a Sunday morning in early spring, Clay found walking the perimeter of the settlement, examining the new irrigation system they'd installed. The morning was crystalline, the sun warming the earth after winter's grip, and the entire landscape seemed to vibrate with possibility. "You've changed things here," he said, falling into step beside her. "When you arrived, I thought you'd either go mad or leave. I didn't think you'd actually transform the place." "We transformed each other," replied carefully. She'd learned to speak truth with Clay, but truth on the frontier required honesty about complexity rather than the polite fictions of Eastern society. "I came here believing civilization meant imposing Eastern standards. You came believing civilization was antithetical to freedom. Neither of us was entirely right. And now—" She stopped walking and turned to face him fully. "Now I understand that civilization isn't a rigid structure to impose. It's people choosing to build something together, compromising on essentials while respecting what matters to each other. You still work on Sundays, but you also come to service occasionally. I still value education and refinement, but I've learned that physical capability and practical wisdom matter as much as book learning." Clay's expression held something vulnerable, something that contradicted his reputation as the territory's most capable, most independent rancher. "I've been thinking about asking you something," he said, his voice carrying the careful precision of a man choosing words in a language not entirely his own. "Something that would require a fundamental shift in how we've been living." Around them, the settlement bustled with activity, children heading toward school, settlers and cowboys working together on a new barn, Sarah hanging laundry while Robert checked on the irrigation system. The scene embodied everything had hoped for when she arrived: civilization and frontier, refined values and practical capability, two worlds genuinely integrated rather than competing. "I'm listening," said simply. "I want to build a house," Clay continued. "A real house, not a ranch dwelling, with actual floors that don't let the dust in, and windows from back east if we can manage it, and space for books and education. I want to marry you, not because you've become like the frontier, but because you've taught me that civilization and freedom aren't opposing forces. They're both possible if two people are willing to build them together." Felt something shift in her chest, not the romantic flutter she'd been trained to expect from proposal scenes in novels, but something deeper and more real. This was a man who'd fought his own nature to understand her world while asking her to genuinely value his. This was a proposal rooted not in convention, but in the recognition that their collision had created something neither could have built alone. "Yes," she said, and found herself smiling at the simplicity of it. "Even knowing it will require you to live primarily on the ranch, that you'll have cattle and dust and difficult seasons. Even knowing that, and knowing that you'll attend my literary salons and engage with the community in ways that often contradict your natural inclination." She paused, then added with the directness she'd learned on the frontier, "Besides, I've discovered I rather enjoy being dirty." Clay laughed, a genuine, uninhibited sound that echoed across the settlement and caused several people to pause and look toward them. When his laughter faded, he drew her close and kissed her with the same lack of artifice that characterized everything about him. It wasn't the proper kiss prescribed by Eastern courtship rituals. It was honest, fierce, and absolutely real. In that moment, watching the settlement continue its work around them, the seamless collaboration of cowboys and settlers, of Eastern tradition and frontier capability, understood that the collision of worlds hadn't resulted in victory for either side. Instead, it had created something entirely new. A community where both ways of living could flourish, where a woman could be both refined and capable, where a man could be both tough and thoughtful, and where love could bloom not despite their differences but because of them. The frontier had changed her, but she'd changed the frontier too. And in that mutual transformation lay the promise of something neither had predicted when the wagon train first arrived. Not dominance of one world over another, but the genuine integration of two, creating space for all the complexity and beauty that lay between them.